Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Tool, Fear Inoculum. This is a release that has so much hype behind it. The amount of time it's taken for Tool to come together to release their fifth studio album has led to a lot of people highly anticipating this project, wondering when it was going to come out for a good amount of years at this point. There's just so much history to the release of this project that I'm really amazed that it's finally happened and that I'm sitting here reviewing it for you guys. For those of you who may not be super aware about this band or this album and the hype surrounding it, it's been about 13 years since the band dropped their last studio album back in 2006, and since then, fans of this band have been hyping this album up like crazy, and even non-fans of this band, I feel like, have been hyping up the release of this project too, just because, you know, when Tool was going to release a new album just became so popular and almost meme-like in status that the fact that it's finally happened is amazing. Throughout listening to this thing, I was making sure to keep my expectations in check, however, mostly because I feel like after 13 years of waiting, most people, when they come to listen to this new album, are probably going to have one of two reactions due to the hype. Either they're going to really like this thing because, you know, it's the new Tool album and it finally exists and we could actually hear it, or they're going to be overly critical of it because maybe it doesn't live up to the expectations people had for it after 13 years, or, you know, things along those lines. After listening to this thing a good few times, though, I will say that I really enjoyed this record. I think it's a nice addition to the band's catalog, and I think that it rivals some of the quality of the band's other work. I wouldn't say this is one of the band's best albums necessarily, but I think it certainly rivals the quality of some of their weaker albums that they've put out in the past. And I do think that their weaker albums from the past are still pretty strong records overall, and I think the same applies to this new one here. One last thing I want to mention before actually diving in very deeply into my thoughts on this project is that there were actually two versions of this album released. The physical copy version of the album and the digital/streaming copy of the album. And the difference between these two is that the digital/streaming copy includes a few extra instrumental interlude type tracks that expands this album's runtime even longer than it already is. It's not a super big difference between the two copies or anything, but I will be addressing this in a bit more detail later on when I talk about some of these instrumental interlude tracks in particular. But I will be talking about both versions of this album here today, but overall my opinions on both versions really aren't too different from one another. On Fear Inoculum, the band takes the very spacey, heady sound that they were playing around with on albums like Lateralis and 10,000 Days, and expands it to the point where it's pretty much the only thing here on this album. You know, on previous Tool releases, while this sound was present, there were still also some tracks that were maybe a bit more straightforward and easy to digest, at least by Tool's standards. However, that's not really the case here on this new album. One thing that I mentioned when I talked about the title track when it was released as a single was that it seemed like a kind of an odd choice for a single because it just didn't feel really straightforward or single-like in nature. It kind of felt like I was getting a slice of the album just a bit early. And after listening to this album in full, I can kind of see why that was the case, because there's really no good track on this thing to drop as a single. You know, there's no schism or vicarious on this thing, no track that, while it still has that Tool quality to it, it's straightforward in nature, it has a more catchy hook to it or something like that, it's a bit shorter in runtime. Not the case here on this album. Every track here feels really big and large and spacey, you know, with the exception of the instrumental interludes, but, you know, those don't really work as straightforward single tracks for a different reason. And I think that this shift in sound that the band plays around with on this album ends up working out pretty nicely. Pretty much all the songs on this thing, at least the big full-length songs, not the instrumental interludes, feature really long run times, over 10 minutes in length for all of them. They all often feature multiple parts to them, and oftentimes they have this kind of slow building feel to them, like they're building towards something greater, and usually that greater thing that they're building to happens to be maybe a hook that's a bit cathartic and catchy in nature. Maybe it's a bit of instrumental that just has a bit of an explosion in energy, like a guitar solo or something like that, maybe a really cool energetic riff. Overall, this dynamic keeps all these songs feeling interesting during their runtime, even though a lot of these songs are pretty lengthy, and oftentimes they're not super fast or aggressive or really all that in your face. Fear Inoculum overall is a pretty slow-moving album, but I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing here. If you're expecting really straightforward approaches to the songwriting, or things like that, tracks like Schism or Vicarious that I mentioned previously, you might be a bit disappointed because tracks like that, as I said before, don't really pop up on this thing at all. Pretty much all the songs here go for this really slow, hypnotic build. Occasionally you get a release following that build, and usually this process kind of either repeats or it switches over into a different sort of build-up or something along those lines. But regardless of what it's doing, it's always interesting, at least somewhat. The way the guitars and the bass on this thing work back and forth together creates this really hypnotic pattern often that I think is really easy to get sucked into, and on occasion you will have some of those heavier, more traditional Tool-like riffs that pop up on this thing as well that are really nice to see, especially with how they're integrated with the slower, more moody passages in this thing as well. The drums across this album also do a really good job of either capturing the really spacey feel that a lot of these tracks are going for. Maybe one of the best examples of that here is on the title track that opens this up. I love the really spacey, atmospheric drums on this thing. They've grown on me a ton since I first heard this track as well. And just the track overall, while I did like it in my initial song review of it, I have to say that it has grown on me a lot more in the context of the record. And I think it's one of the highlights here overall too. But either way, back to the drums, when they're not doing the atmospheric sort of sound that occasionally pops up on this thing, they're doing your more typical aggressive Tool style of drumming that I think pairs up really nicely with some of the more aggressive bits of guitar and bass playing here. And the vocals on this project that Maynard provides are really great as well. One thing that I think was a bit hit or miss on that A Perfect Circle album we got last year were his vocals, so I'm really happy to see that here on this new Tool album there aren't really any weak moments from him vocally. They're all really powerful, all really straightforward, they all hit really nicely. I just think he kills the vocals on this thing. Lyrically, this album seems to cover a variety of different topics, but whatever it's covering, it always seems to do it in that typical, kind of quirky, kind of heady way that Tool does their lyrics. The track Culling Voices seems to be talking about this person whose inner thoughts about themselves, maybe from the perspectives of other people, I guess, or maybe the things that bring this person down the most and maybe becomes kind of their biggest point of self-destruction, if you will. The track Invincible seems to be talking about like this warrior type character who is struggling, I guess, to remain relevant, and I wonder if on some level this track is supposed to be about Tool themselves, given the fact that they're kind of a veteran band at this point, and here on this album it's of course an attempt from them to, I guess, try to remain relevant, and I'm sure the band members themselves are aware of the fact that coming into this new album, whether or not this thing was going to be well received or not, and whether or not fans were going to like it, was something that was going to be up in the air, and I have to kind of wonder if this track was written about that, or maybe it was written about something else completely, and I'm completely off the mark with that guess, but I don't know, I thought it was kind of interesting in that regard. And on the closing song to the record, at least the final full-length track that is The Tempest, the lyrics seem to be talking about this figure that has a mixture of power and this belief that everything around them is going okay, and of course this combination ends up with some pretty bad results happening. At least that's kind of how I interpreted it. And even outside of the lyrics here on this song, I think The Tempest is one of the strongest songs that the band has penned, maybe in their entire career. Even though this is the longest song on the album, I don't feel like there's a second of it that really wastes any bit of its runtime doing anything that's a bit extra or uninteresting. I think all the instrumentals here on this track are really powerful and moving. I think Maynard's vocals are at their strongest here on this track as well. I think the way that they combine with the lyrics leads to some very powerful moments too. And I love the way that this closes out the record. You know, if you exclude the instrumental track that comes at the very end of this thing in the digital version, this is essentially the last thing that the band does here on the project, and it's a really grand way for them to go out. I don't know if Tool have any plans to release another album in the future. I know it seems way too early to be thinking about that now, but I'm just saying that if they decide not to, or anything like that, The Tempest is a really good track to end things on. Once again, if you ignore the final instrumental interlude type track at the end here. Since I've been bringing up those instrumental interludes so much at this point, I feel like now is an appropriate time to talk about them. Now, on previous Tool projects, we've always gotten some instrumental interludes that, you know, for the most part, I think have been rather well done. For the most part, instrumental interludes really aren't my thing. They tend to just waste runtime on the album, in my opinion, for the most part. A lot of albums that use them, I think, don't really need to use them. However, on previous Tool releases, I think that they added a ton of personality and character to the projects they were on, and they never really lasted for too long. Coming into this project here, though, I have to say that this is probably the weakest crop of instrumental tracks that the band has brought onto an album to date. Not necessarily because any of them sound super terrible or anything, but they're just not super interesting. For the most part, they're, I guess, fine for what they are, but I don't know, they just don't engage with me in any meaningful way, with the exception of one track that I'll talk about later on. The majority of them are just a bit boring, and I guess the purpose of having them here on the project is to transition between some of the longer tracks. However, I don't really feel like that's necessary, because with the way that these longer tracks are structured, with their build-ups and their slower pacing, I feel like that they flow between each other really nicely as is, without these instrumental interludes popping up to get in the way. Not to mention that a lot of these tracks end up taking up a good bit of the album's runtime. Like, pretty much all of these are several minutes long, and I just don't feel like they need to be that long, or that they really need to be there at all. The only instrumental cut on here that I really enjoyed was the track Chocolate Chip Trip, which is the only instrumental song here that actually also made it onto the physical release of the album as well. Not really all that surprising, considering it's easily the strongest out of all the instrumental cuts here, mostly because it has a really defined personality to it. It's this really trippy, of course, electronic influenced cut that also has a really playful nature to it, I guess. Unlike a lot of the other songs here, I think that makes it stand out amongst a lot of these other really long, more serious cuts. I don't know, I think it's just a little fun diversion in the track list. I do kind of wish it was a bit shorter than like close to 5 minutes long, but I really can't complain too much with it. I think it has a lot of personality to it. I like the sounds the band is playing around with here. And as far as instrumental cuts go on this thing, like I said, easily the strongest one here. Definitely deserves to stay on the, shorter physical release version of the album. But as far as the other ones go, I didn't really care for them all too much. If you want to know which version of the album you should listen to, I say give the longer version a listen just to see, and then check out the shorter one as well. Personally, I think the shorter one might be a bit more to the point, though I have a feeling a lot of Tool fans are just going to like the longer version more because, it's more Tool, and especially after 13 years of waiting, some fans are just going to want more of this band at this point, and I can perfectly understand that. Aside from a lot of these instrumental interludes, another kind of minor problem I have with this album is that at times I do kind of feel like some of the main course tracks on this thing could be a bit shorter than they are. I know it's probably going to be another unpopular opinion given that, we've waited so long for this new album. I'm sure some fans are just going to be so happy that we got so much content here on this new thing. But I do feel like some of these cuts maybe could use with a little bit of trimming. Not a ton of trimming or anything. I don't want these songs to be super short, but, maybe like a minute or two could have made some of these tracks a bit more concise, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, make that little change, and I think some of these songs would still maintain the same hypnotic build-ups that they already have, but just do it in a more focused manner. But overall, I feel like Fear Inoculum is still a pretty great album, all things considered. I do have some minor complaints with it, like I said before, but the fact that one of those complaints can be easily avoided with a different release of this album, I kind of feel like complaining about it is kind of unnecessary in some regards because, like I said, that version of the album was also officially released in addition to the longer version with the instrumental cuts. So for the most part, I think that Fear Inoculum is an album without a ton of flaws to it. Like I said before, I think that this is probably one of the weaker releases that the band has put out, but I still think it's a pretty strong one overall. I like the fact that on this release the band decided to actually take their pre-existing sound and expand on it more and try something new with it instead of just doing, the same thing yet again, because I feel like they could have done that here on this release. After 13 years, I feel like Tool fans would have eaten anything up at this point, but the fact that the band decided to actually do something new here and actually make an album that was worthwhile is something I could really appreciate. And I think that for the most part here ended up working up in the band's favor because much of this album is really fun to listen to. So overall, yeah, Fear Inoculum, at least in my own opinion, was, worth the wait to some extent. I have a feeling if you come into this expecting an album that took 13 years to craft and is going to be the greatest album ever made or something, you're going to be let down because no album out there is going to be able to live up to those expectations. But if you come into this thing expecting, a good release from Tool and nothing more, I think you'll be satisfied with this project because I think this is certainly a good album from the band, and as I said before, I really appreciate the fact that they tried some new things here as well. So Tool fans, definitely check this out. I mean, you probably don't need me to tell you that, but even if you aren't a Tool fan and you're kind of curious in getting into this group, this is an album that you should definitely get around to listening to at some point or another. I do feel like the band has albums that are probably better to start with, but this is one that, like I just said, you should definitely get around to listening to at some point because it is a great album, as I said before. But overall, yeah, that is just my own personal opinion on this project. If you happen to disagree with that opinion, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also hit the like button on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you guys for watching once again. One last thing I want to say here before I end the video, something I said in my last couple reviews and videos as well, but I'm on a new location, if you couldn't already tell, and essentially I'm just looking for feedback. If you guys like this new background that I've been working with in my past few videos, if you guys think everything, the lighting, the volume here, it's all working fine. If you guys have any, complaints, input, criticism, anything, leave it in the comment section down below as well, in addition to your thoughts on this new album here today. And yeah, that's everything. Thank you guys for watching. I can't believe I finally got to review this new Tool album. I can't believe it exists. But yeah, stay golden.